In one of the Sherlock Holmes detective stories, the great man solves a case by noting something that didn't happen. A dog didn't bark. And of course, there must have been a reason for that. And so Canadians who are entering the later stages of their federal election might equally be excused for asking the question, what stopped the Donald Trump dog from barking recently? Because yes, for a man who was slating Canada almost daily, mocking its then leader Trudeau almost daily, calling him the governor of the 51st state and all of that, he has been remarkably quiet, unnaturally quiet. Who even knew that Trump had the ability to hold his tongue on any subject for so long? Even seeing it in action is like watching the velociraptor in Jurassic Park learning how to use the door handle. The answer, of course, is that Trump's abuse and threats towards Canada have galvanized its people like never before, and it completely transformed the election race and looks likely, and nothing's ever certain in elections, but likely to overturn what had looked like an inevitable Conservative victory, at least over the last couple of years. Now, at the point of shooting this video, as the televised debates in French and then in English were taking place, the polls are still showing a small but substantial lead for Mark Carney and the Liberal Party over Pierre Poilièvre, who had seemed on course for victory with a massive lead until Trump sent off his broadsides. Trump may have pulled back from some of the most extreme and random tariffs that he announced on so-called Liberation Day recently, but many of the Canada tariffs remain. But the rhetoric has completely gone, and it ended almost overnight following the president's March 28 phone call, his first call indeed, with Mark Carney. In sharp contrast to his previous rhetoric with Carney's predecessor, Trump reported the call respectfully. He referred to Carney as Prime Minister and made no disparaging comments. And then he said no more. There's a creative claim as to what happened in that phone call, which we'll talk about at the end. But the most likely explanation is simply that Trump had it brought home to him just how much he had screwed it up. Not that any of the people in his orbit would have dared to use that form of words to him, not to his face anyway, but the impact of his approach has been so overwhelming, the evidence for the damage so clearly to be seen in the polls to the Conservative cause, and the way that Canadians were responding to his tariffs so united. He realised that he had inadvertently cost his political soulmate, Pierre Poilièvre, the election, and that the only way to possibly retrieve the situation in time was to be respectful to the Liberals, hopefully damning them by association, declare a degree of distaste for Poilièvre to try and help him distance himself from him with the electorate, and then shut his mouth for the rest of the campaign. In other words, to do something that is totally alien to his nature, to try not being the centre of the story. To do that knowing that him saying something loses support that he wants to gain, it doesn't gain it. Something that requires a degree of emotional maturity that we had seen little evidence for before. Don Braid, writing in the Calgary Herald over a week ago, reported the surge of hopeful thinking in the Poilièvre camp. They were telling him that their campaigners on the doorsteps were seeing a change now that Trump had been quiet for a while. The rationale of the polling has been that if the election is about Trump, then Mark Carney benefits, as he is widely held to be the best place to deal with Trump and to have the economic experience to handle the shocks to the system that Trump will bring about. But if Donald Trump fades into the background and the campaign becomes about the economy generally, and rather than the change candidate from Trudeau, Carney becomes the continuity candidate for the Liberals, then that plays better for Poilièvre. Of course, political campaigns worldwide routinely claim all sorts of optimistic things about what they're hearing on the doorsteps. Sometimes they're telling the truth, Sometimes they're just trying to generate the impression of momentum because that alone can affect a race. Now, so far, the suggestion is not showing up in the polling, which shows Carney still sitting firmly on his lead. That lead is more to do with the squeezing of a vote for the other parties to consolidate around the Liberals than it is any kind of big switch up of votes away from Conservatives. But the outcome remains pretty solid regardless. Trump's silence, however, has started to be noticed back in the USA. Earlier this week, Trump's press secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked if it meant that he had changed his position on Canada, this silence.
He stopped talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, at least publicly. I'm wondering if that's on purpose and why.
I would reject the president's position on Canada has shifted. Perhaps he just hasn't been asked about Canada by questions from this group in the Oval Office when they see him almost every day, but the president still maintains his position on Canada. The United States has been subsidizing Canada's national defense, and he believes that Canadians would benefit greatly from becoming the 51st state of the United States of America.
Now look, we generally get the idea that even asking such a question's bit of a waste of time, because Caroline Leavitt will always swear that Trump is solid behind whatever was the last thing he said on a topic. But she knows, and we know, that at any point he could just come out and say the exact opposite with no warning whatsoever. She will then just turn on a dime and defend and swear that that's always been his position. I'm not aware of any additional insight that has been added to any question in the last 3 months from asking it of Caroline Leavitt. Those press conferences seem to be purely an exercise for Leavitt to gain brownie points by being incredibly rude to mainstream media journalists.
Through Mexico, not Canada. So what else does Canada need to do?
You're asking me for what the president's justification is for these tariffs. It's not up to you. You're not the president, Gabe. And frankly, I think it's a little bit disrespectful to the families in this country who have lost loved ones at the hands of this deadly poison.
But I digress. I think Canadians are generally realistic enough to know that the minute the election is done, the Trump megaphone will wind right back up all over again. If Carney wins, and like I say, that can't be taken for granted, given how reluctant Poilièvre's voters might be to tell pollsters their real voting intentions right now. But if he wins, I doubt it will endure for long that he will have only had respectful words said of him by Donald Trump. The question will be whether Trump's short-term realization that he screwed up will translate into any kind of understanding that if he was really serious about wanting to benefit from Canada, he went about it in the way most calculated to achieve the opposite result. Now, I doubt annexation was ever achievable. However he approached it, at least outside of some seismic external threat that completely changed geopolitical realities. But in any case, it certainly isn't now, and never will be so long as he's the guy who's actually doing the asking. So does he absorb that and change his strategy, decide what sort of relationship he can recover from the mess, and go about creating the circumstances for it? Or is he, as some suggest, totally incapable of learning from information, so that he will just keep plugging away? More tariffs, more economic pain. Surely if he can pile it on a bit thicker and a bit thicker, eventually those crazy Canucks will start to see things his way. I said I would mention the more creative takes on this, and it's worth doing because it's creative. It's not wholly crazy. Some have been saying that the sell-off of US Treasuries that stood out in the days after Trump's Liberation Day and which pushed him into hitting the pause button, that sell-off was led by Canada. And indeed, we were told Canada had liaised with Europeans and Japan. Japan, of course, is the biggest owner of US Treasuries and is indeed believed to have been where some, if not most, of the sell-off actually took place. And this, we're told, was Carney showing his strategic mettle. Now, at the time of shooting this video, there seems to be no evidence for that story, and it seems unlikely, and certainly unlikely that it was included in the substance of the phone conversation between Carney and Trump, because that took place before the major tariff craziness even began. That doesn't take away, of course, from the fact that yes, Canada and Japan and many European countries do indeed hold an awful lot of American debt. And while Trump is always one to maximise the use of his leverage against other people, well, that's a solid piece of leverage that the world holds over him. Right now, it's not using it. The latest auction of US Treasuries went just fine. But it's there, it's ready. And the more Trump recognises that, the more likely it might be that he will privately feel the need to moderate the craziness as it impacts the parts of the world currently propping his country up. One of which, unfortunately for him, of course, is China. Now, I'm not saying I think it's likely, but let's at least take comfort from the reality that nothing goes only one way. Canadians and Europeans will get their moments to push back against the bully. Good luck to all Canadians of whichever political persuasion you are in the forthcoming election. May it stand as yet another proud advertisement of the qualities north of the border that are currently, shall we say, somewhat under attack or under question further south.